The summer I turned 20 was the summer everything changed. It wasn't just the heat or the endless days by the lake that marked it as different. It was him. His name was Daniel, and he was my best friend's father. He was everything I wasn't at that time. Confident, self-assured, and effortlessly charismatic. He had a way of filling a room with his presence, his laughter echoing like a melody I couldn't get out of my head. I had known him for years, but that summer, something shifted. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to face. It started innocently enough. My best friend, Claire, and I had been inseparable since middle school. Her family lived in a sprawling farmhouse just outside of Willow Creek, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. Claire's parents were warm and welcoming, always treating me like one of their own. Her father, Daniel, was a different story. He had always been kind to me, but distant, as if he saw me as nothing more than Claire's awkward friend. That summer, though, he started to notice me in a way that made my heart race and my stomach twist with a mix of excitement and dread. The first time I felt it was at a bonfire by the lake. Claire's family hosted it every year, inviting friends and neighbors to gather around the fire, roast marshmallows, and share stories. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the sound of laughter, a perfect summer night. I was sitting on a log, staring into the flames, lost in thought. The firelight danced on the water, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the people around me. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching the scene from a distance. That's when Daniel sat down beside me. He was close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the smoky aroma of the fire. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Everything okay?" I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, just tired." He studied me for a moment, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "You're not the same kid who used to follow Claire around everywhere," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You've grown up." I felt my cheeks flush and looked away, unsure of how to respond. His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to unpack. I had always felt invisible, like a shadow trailing behind Claire, but Daniel's words made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The bonfire continued around us, the crackling flames and the hum of conversation creating a cocoon of warmth. But all I could focus on was Daniel's presence beside me. Every now and then, I caught him glancing at me, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. It made my heart race in a way I didn't understand. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just being friendly, but deep down, I knew something was different. When the fire began to die down and people started to leave, Daniel stood and offered me his hand. "Come on," he said. "I'll walk you back to the house." I hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, his grip firm and warm. As we walked through the tall grass, the sound of crickets filled the night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the fields. I felt a strange sense of intimacy, as if we were the only two people in the world. "You know," he said after a while, "you're different from the other kids Claire hangs out with." I glanced at him, surprised. "How so?" He shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "You're more thoughtful, more mature. It's refreshing." I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent. When we reached the house, he held the door open for me, his eyes meeting mine as I passed. "Good night, Alex," he said softly. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As the weeks went by, Daniel's attention became more frequent and more intense. It started with small things, a lingering glance, a casual touch on the shoulder, a compliment that felt too personal to be innocent. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down, I knew something was different. The way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, it was as if he saw something in me that no one else did. One evening, Claire and I were in the kitchen, making popcorn and arguing over what movie to watch. Daniel walked in, his presence immediately commanding the room. He leaned against the counter, watching us with an amused smile. "You two are worse than an old married couple," he teased, his eyes flickering to mine. Claire rolled her eyes. "Stop, Dad. You're just jealous because you don't have anyone to argue with." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that made my chest tighten. "Maybe I do," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned to leave. Claire didn't seem to notice, but I did. My heart raced as I tried to focus on the popcorn, my hands trembling slightly. I told myself I was imagining things, that Daniel was just being friendly, but the look in his eyes told a different story. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I replayed every interaction, every glance, every word, trying to make sense of what was happening. I felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or jump. One afternoon, Claire and I decided to go swimming in the lake. The sun was high in the sky, and the water sparkled like diamonds. We laughed and splashed each other, the cool water a welcome relief from the summer heat. For a moment, I felt like a kid again, carefree and happy. Daniel showed up later, carrying a cooler of drinks. He set it down on the dock and stripped off his shirt, revealing a toned chest that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. He dove into the water, surfacing near us with a grin. "Having fun?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. Claire, oblivious to the tension, splashed him with water, and he retaliated, sending a wave in her direction. I tried to join in, but my movements felt stiff and awkward under Daniel's gaze. After a while, Claire climbed out of the water to sunbathe on the dock, leaving me alone with Daniel. He swam closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're a good swimmer," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Thanks," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. The turning point came on a hot, humid night in late July. Claire had gone to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with Daniel. The air was thick with tension, the silence between us charged with something I couldn't name. He sat on the couch, his long legs stretched out in front of him, while I perched on the edge of the armchair, trying to seem casual. "You're always so tense," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Why is that?" I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know. I guess I just overthink things." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't have to overthink with me," he said, his voice soft but intense. "You can relax." I nodded, though my body betrayed me with a shiver that ran down my spine. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Come here," he said, patting the spot beside him on the couch. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why?" He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my stomach twist. "Because I want to talk to you." "Is that so strange?" I forced myself to move, sitting beside him on the couch. He was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne. My mind screamed at me to get up, to put some distance between us, but I stayed rooted to the spot. "You're a good kid," he said, his voice low and steady. But you're not a kid anymore, are you? I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. His hand brushed against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. You're special, he murmured, his eyes searching mine. You know that, right? I nodded, though I wasn't sure what he meant. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin. My heart raced as I felt the warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze. Relax, he said softly, his face inches from mine. You're safe with me. The next moment happened so quickly that I barely had time to process it. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was brief but electric. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine for a reaction. This doesn't change anything, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's just between us. I nodded, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of which made any sense. What had I just done? What did it mean? And what would happen next? He leads me to a room, his hand gently guiding my waist. He pulls me close, his eyes burning with intensity. Our lips meet, a tentative touch that quickly deepens into a passionate kiss. I wanted to resist, to pull away, but something within me, a primal longing, held me captive. He leads my hand to his chest, his touch a warm, insistent pressure. My fingers tremble as I comply. He moves slowly, tenderly, his movements a careful exploration. My initial apprehension gives way to a surprising sense of surrender. It's a dizzying blend of sensation and emotion, a feeling I've never experienced before. The rest of the summer passed in a blur. I avoided Daniel as much as I could, but it was impossible to escape the tension that hung between us. Every glance, every touch, every word felt loaded with meaning, a reminder of the line we had crossed. I hated myself for letting it happen, for not stopping it sooner, but I also hated the part of me that didn't want it to stop, the part that craved the attention and validation he had given me. By the time summer ended, I was a mess. I avoided Claire, too ashamed to face her, and eventually, our friendship faded. The weight of the secret was too much to bear, and I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Looking back, I still struggle to make sense of that summer. It left a scar, a reminder of the lines we cross when desire overpowers judgment and the damage that can be done in the name of connection. I often wonder if Daniel ever thought about me after that, if he ever felt the same guilt that consumed me. But some questions are better left unanswered.